Hey there. I want you to do something with me. I want you to close your eyes and picture. It's the 1830s. King Richard III is now being kept from his throne and his riches by King Andrew. And he knows that the only way he's going to be able to claim his throne again and all the money that goes with it is if he eliminates King Andrew. Now, I know what you're thinking. Hey, Dreamy, you're screwing up the history again. King Richard III lived and died like 400 years earlier, right? I mean, yeah, maybe. But that wasn't the belief of a man named Richard Lawrence, who was an out-of-work house painter at the time. He hadn't always been out of work, hadn't always been a house painter. He was born in England in the 19th century to a poor family with, unsurprisingly now, a history of mental illness. He had come to America with his father in 1812. Now, if you'll recall what else happened in 1812, the United States had a little war with England again. Being an Englishman in America at the time was not a good time, especially not around D.C., and that's where they settled. The United States government was trying to repatriate all of the new arrivals like the Lawrences. And along the same time, the British Army had invaded D.C., burned a lot of the city to the ground. There was a lot of anti-British sentiment in the area, in the country as a whole, but in D.C. especially. And young Richard Lawrence was being picked on for it. He was already impoverished. He was already far from home. He was already coming from a history of mental illness, and his mother had passed. If anybody was a recipe for madness, it was this kid. One of the heroes of that war for the Americans was Andrew Jackson, nicknamed Old Hickory, because he was as tough as Hickory wood. Also nicknamed Jackass, because he was kind of a dick. I mean, he wasn't just fierce and violent in battle. He would challenge anybody who disagreed with him. He would fight, he would argue, he would belittle, he would get violent, and he would threaten more violence. Richard Lawrence, on the other hand, was kind of a gentle soul. Very quiet, very polite, hardworking and studious. He'd taken an apprenticeship as a house painter, and he was popular. He did impeccable work, he had a good work ethic, and he was polite. And he very quickly found success as a house painter. He ended up setting up his own shop at a very young age. Life was good, money was coming in. He met a woman that he had fallen in love with, and he started saving because he had every intention of asking her to marry him. He bought an empty lot in the city where he was going to build a home for her. saved up $800. Good sum back in the 1830s. He probably should have felt that out a little bit more, though, because when he asked her to marry him, she said no. He was heartbroken. He decided that he was going to take a little break. He started painting landscapes, and he wasn't bad. He began studying the great English artists, and he was painting in the style of these romantic era paintings, and he was doing a good job, still working as a house painter, but he was throwing himself into creativity. Jackson was still fighting with people at the time. Like, he lost his entire cabinet at one point over what was called the Petticoat Affair. Of all the things that Jackson did, and he did a lot of awful things, right? He said that abolitionists were horrible people who deserved to be killed. He owned slaves. He was responsible for the Indian removal at the time, just because he had a personal vendetta against Native Americans. He went after the Second National Bank because he had a problem with the bank manager, the bank president. He was ironic, actually. He was also against paper money. He only wanted to have metal money. He wanted coins only. So it's kind of ironic that he's on the $20 bill, actually. One of the things he did do right, though, was he stood up for Peggy Eaton. Peggy Eaton was the wife of his Secretary of War, John Eaton. She had been a barmaid in her father's tavern and inn, a place where a lot of politicians had frequented. And in her early years, she learned to be an intelligent, witty conversationalist who was well informed in what was going on in politics. But because she was a barmaid, sometimes she had a reputation with the other wives in the cabinet who ostracized her. They were mean girls. They were absolute mean girls. His Vice President, John Calhoun's wife, really just thought of herself as the moral compass of the whole whole government, really, because the wives influenced the husbands. And Andrew Jackson's wife sadly had passed in the first year of his term, so she would have been the head of that little group, but as she was gone, it fell to John C. Calhoun's wife. They were mean to Peggy, and Jackson, whose own wife had suffered similar accusations because she was still married to another man when they kind of got together. He took it personally. He stood up for Peggy just like he stood up for his own wife. And it was a very decent thing. But it also cost him a great deal in a time when so much politicking was done at social events. Nobody would invite Peggy and her husband to their parties, and no one would go to Peggy and her husband's parties. So it was affecting the entire cabinet. That was referred to as the petticoat affair in history. John C. Calhoun actually turned on Jackson himself and started politicking against him. He joined the opposing party and became one of Jackson's greatest detractors. While all of this was going down, Richard Lawrence, the house painter, was suffering. He was starting to have conversations with himself. And then laughing, crazy laughter. His sister and her husband became a little bit concerned for him. But she thought that he would get better over time. He didn't. After he'd saved up all of that money to ask that woman to marry him, Richard Lawrence decided that he was going to take that money and quit his job, and he was going to go to England and enroll in art school. He was going to learn directly from the masters. He worked hard and saved up even more money. His customers even started donating to help him achieve his dream because he was that popular. He left in November of 1832, and he said that he was going to go to New York City, where he was going to catch the first boat to England. He came back really shortly after, and he said he'd never made it out of New York. When he was asked what had happened, he just said, "Oh, it's too cold to travel." And then his story changed. He said that no one would give him passage out of New York because the papers had written negative things about him. He said that he was going to have to get his own ship in order to go to England. Now, the odds that any newspaper was going to be writing about some random house painter who was going to England to study how to paint like the masters, really not likely. There's no evidence to suggest that any of this is true. Not that I know of, not that I've found. But that wasn't the only way he started acting strangely. He started complaining that his tailors were intentionally making his suits not fit. He started dressing like an English dandy because this was the Regency era. He'd be like that. He grew a mustache, started wearing a top hat, that type of thing. He started spending his money. He started getting luxury items like saddles, expensive saddles. Now, he didn't own a horse, but he had expensive saddles. He started hiring sex workers to just be driven around town with him. At one point, he told his family that he was again leaving for England, and he instead went to Philadelphia, stayed at an expensive hotel, just kind of living a grand life that, he had some money for, but it wasn't going to be lasting that long, especially not when he was not working. And when he did work, his work had become sloppy. and he'd become a little bit cranky. He would start on nonsensical rants. He was beginning to show signs of schizophrenia, talking to people who weren't there, threatening people. He started threatening the sister that loved him. And then he became violent. He attacked his sister. He'd been hitting her, and at one time he just threw her to the ground and was trying to beat her over the head with a 4-pound weight. That was enough for her husband. He was clearly not getting better, and her husband called the police. He was brought to jail on assault charges, and there's no real indication of why, but he was let go. Maybe he said he was sorry, but they let him go. Problem is, though, he'd been living with his sister, so now he's homeless. He started going from boarding house to boarding house, and he would stay there as long as he could until he couldn't pay anymore. And he would still go to his paint shop every morning. He'd still, go to work, stand in the doorway, muttering to himself. But he also started paying attention to politics. And he started going to Capitol Hill to watch the congressional debates, which people were allowed to do back then. And he would listen to John C. Calhoun rant about Jackson. Richard Lawrence started to become a little obsessed with Andrew Jackson. He started to believe that he was a British noble, and contradictorily also that his father had been in the American military and was one of 6 militiamen that Andrew Jackson had executed for just being deserters. In his convoluted mind, Richard Lawrence thought that he was a royal heir and that he had land and titles in England that were owed to him by inheritance, again, somehow through the U.S. Congress. And he thought that Jackson was keeping Congress from repaying him. At some point, his delusions became a little bit grander, and instead of just thinking that he was a royal heir, he thought now that he was the actual King of England. I mean, he wasn't. For the record, England had a king. But he sort of lost touch with that. Richard Lawrence had begun muttering about Andrew Jackson in front of people and making threats, but aside from his sister, he made threats to a lot of people, and it's unclear if they knew what he'd done to his sister, but I mean, people were just accustomed to hearing it. And on top of that, a lot of people disliked Jackson as well, so hearing someone threatening Jackson was not that really unusual. Hearing Jackson threaten other people was not that unusual, not that noteworthy. Richard Lawrence learned from another boarder at the boarding house he was currently staying in that this guy was a coffin maker, and he'd just finished making a coffin for Congressman Warren Davis. who was an ally of Jackson's. And so Richard Lawrence asked him, hey, is Jackson going to be at the funeral? And the guy said, yeah. So Lawrence started target practice with 2 brass pistols. Then, on the day of the attempted assassination, he had stood in the doorway of his shop just reading a book, and people said he just closed his book and laughed and said to himself, I'll be damned if I don't do it. And he grabs his pistols and he heads out the doors, puts them in his jacket, and he's going to Capitol Hill to go meet and kill the President of the United States. He gets to the funeral and he spots Jackson, but keep in mind that paranoid delusions and hallucinations aside, at his core, Richard Lawrence was a polite person. He didn't want to interrupt a funeral. That would not be kind. So he heads out to the rotunda to wait, because he knows everybody's going to be coming out anyway soon. He just heads out and waits. He sees Jackson coming out after the funeral, and he moves to get closer. He actually moves to the right side of Jackson because he doesn't want the ball to pass through Jackson and hit anybody else. He wants to aim in a direction that there's a wall behind Jackson instead of another person. He's a very polite assassin. He's a very considerate homicidal maniac. He pulls out his gun and he fires. Bang! Smoke! People stand around going, what the fuck? And nothing. Jackson's still standing there. It was a really damp day. His powder was wet, damp, and it didn't fire. While everyone else is still kind of stunned or wondering what's going on, Richard Lawrence drops the first pistol. He's got a backup, and he's going to try again. But Andrew Jackson, all of 67 years old at this point, he's unwell. He's walking with a cane. He lurches forward. He raises his cane. He's going to beat the shit out of this dude. Richard Lawrence is startled, and he shoots again, but it misfires as well. Both pistols absolutely misfired. And now Jackson is coming at him with a cane. He tries to run off, but he's caught by Davy fucking Crockett, the bear wrestling Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. That Davy Crockett. Remember the Alamo? Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett catches him, holds him down, so that old man Jackson can kick his ass. He finally gets dragged off and thrown in jail, where he is interviewed by doctors. And once again, Richard Lawrence, polite, calm, gentle, just well-spoken. It's just very coherent and intelligent. Until you mention Jackson, and then he loses his shit again, right? Ranting about what a tyrant Jackson is. and how next time he'd get him. It just absolutely nuts. When he's being interviewed by doctors, it comes out that not only did he think that he was, by this point, King Richard III, he also believed that he could not rise until the president fell. Those were his words. He believed the reason his work had dried up was not because he was doing sloppy work and he had gone insane, but because Jackson had fucked with the bank. And he thought that with the president gone, the National Bank would return and there would be more money for people and people would have more work. He wasn't just doing it for himself, you see. You know, he was a king of the people. He was looking out for you. Of course, the doctors thought that he was insane. And he goes to trial, and he proves that they're right. He's coming into trial and literally telling everyone there that he's above them because he's the fucking king. At one point, he's told to sit down and settle down by one of the members of the court, and he's like, "You mind your business or I'll treat you with severity." He's convinced that he's still going to be king, and it's going to be within his power to teach this guy a lesson about manners. At one point, he basically says, "Judge me, fuck you, I'm judging you," to the entire court. He's going to pass judgment on them. The jury took all of 5 minutes to come back with a decision of not guilty due to reasons of insanity, making Richard Lawrence not only the first attempted presidential assassin, but also the first person to be found not guilty by reason of his insanity in the United States. He is impressive that way. He was committed to a nearby asylum and spent the rest of his life there, painting landscapes. And he was actually kind of popular with the other inmates and with visitors and workers. He would grant people lands and titles because he's the king and he can do that, right? And that's how he spent the rest of his life. He died in that asylum, believing that he was the rightful king of England being kept from his throne by Andrew Jackson, who, I should point out, had died like 15 years earlier. So there's that. But that is the story of the first attempted presidential assassin against Andrew Jackson, who was a dick, but also had his moments of being a decent person. Thank you for listening to another Whispery History. You have a great day.